Essentially, this is what must be developed. The art of giving out in love and intelligence what is taken in from vision and the experience of self-transcendence and solidarity with the universe. Das ist es im Wesentlichen, was wir weiterentwickeln müssen. Die Kunst, mit Liebe und Intelligenz das weiterzugeben, was wir in der Vision und in der Erfahrung der Selbsttranszendierung und des Einsseins mit dem Universum aufgenommen haben.
Durch die grenzenauflösende Erfahrung mit Meditation, psychedelischer Rockmusik und bewusstseinserweiternden Substanzen wie LSD konnte die 68er-Generation instinktiv jene geniale Theorie integrieren, die Marshall McLuhan zur selben Zeit entwickelte: dass die Nutzung der linearen Medien lineare Gesellschaften und lineares Denken produziert und dass es bestimmte Wege gibt, aus der Tunnelrealität unserer Vorstellungen herauszubrechen, individuell wie kollektiv.
Let me turn to the main event. I've got a snoot full of tequila and a messianic mission, pawing the ground to talk to you as usual. I guess the title of tonight's talk is Linear Societies and Nonlinear Drugs, which is something that I just had to pull out of the air when Ken finally slammed me to the wall for what I would be talking about this night many months ago. But more and more for me, especially with this group, these things have become sort of summations and I guess I hope convivial examinations of just where we are, we each and every one of us, and then this enterprise, whatever we mean by that, in the context of everything else that's happening in the world. In other words, the psychedelic experience, the entheogenic experience contextualized. And as I try to think about, what, if anything, I can bring to the party, I guess it's that what I'm interested in is psychedelics as a philosophical tool. And when I concretized that for myself, I realized there's no claims on that part of discourse. No one wants to do this. Academic philosophy is done in a very formal manner, and the most exciting is incredibly stuffy. And yet, I, like most of you, I assume, have taken on board in my life this thing called the psychedelic experience, which is then as large a portion of my being as my sexuality, my politics, my education. It shapes everything. And yet nowhere in the world of philosophical discourse is there any genuflection, at least overtly, made to this. Maybe not since Plato. We talked about shadows on the wall of a cave and so forth and so on. Well, so what can psychedelics and the psychedelic experience bring to philosophy? And what do I mean by philosophy? By philosophy I mean the enterprise of discursive thinking, trying to understand what the world is and who's asking the question. Where did the world come from? Where is it bound? And who's along for the ride? And it seems to me that we, as a community, have, this is sort of hard to wrap your mind around, at least for me, but we have, in a sense, inculcated into ourselves the image of an underclass, so that we struggle for legal toleration of our practices and our habits, but we don't struggle for intellectual legitimation of our visions. We accept that they are somehow contextually marginal. And as I thought about that, I realized that that is a limitation on the community, that the information which is coming from the psychedelic experience as interpreted by Western people is primary evidence for the need for a major paradigm shift in the whole way the Western mentality does business. Well, what kind of evidence and what kind of shift? Well, there's a lot of talk in our community, and there has been for many, many years, about shamanism. And when we seek to legitimize ourselves through a historical argument, we reach back to shamanism and we say we're part of something which is 100,000 years old and worldwide and touched the spirit long before the shadow of the cross fell over Jerusalem, and so forth and so on. All true. And in a way that has, I think, that tendency, which is part of the broader tendency in the Western mind to valorize and grow nostalgic over the primitive, has put a certain political cast on our stance and our position. But what we are is, again contextually, is a culture of science. And I'm speaking now of our community. It's the Albert Hoffmans and the Dave Nichols and the Sasha Shulgins who have kept our canoe afloat. These are men of science. It's methods, it's vocabulary, it's culture. We have not, though we certainly honor those people and love them, as their rhetoric is not the primary rhetoric of the larger community of psychedelic users, which tends toward this, as I refer to it, this shamanistic aboriginal nostalgia. This, I mean, then let me just turn left here for a moment and say, I feel more comfortable with the scientific end of things. I think the news coming out of science is the most psychedelic news there is. When I go to the internet, I go to things like Science Alert and the Hubble Picture of the Day and this sort of thing. And our community as a whole, I think, is not involved enough in incorporating the vistas. If, you know, while we struggle to legalize psychedelics, psychedelic thinking is everywhere triumphant, because the instruments built by linear science throw open doorways on the unimaginable, and the most revered and hoary hefes of the scientific establishment have to genuflect before this stuff. I mean, what am I talking about? Well, for example, Science magazine wrote last week that the most important scientific breakthrough of 1998 was the apparent observation and agreement upon that observation by the astrophysical community of a cosmological constant. This sounds like very deep physics, but if I give it to you as a headline, what it means is the entire universe, every atom and every empty space of it, is ruled by a very weird force that has now been seriously known to science for precisely 5 months. a force which is apparently going to overcome gravity's tendency to collapse the universe and to cause it to expand in a very explosive and counterintuitive and psychedelic fashion that is the complete confoundment of the core science that Western linear thinking has built. And of course there weren't riots in the streets and the electricity didn't fail, but at the very pinnacles of the antenna of the evolving civilization, there was a shudder felt in the force, you may be sure. So, there are two much larger forces than our community that are in play in terms of shaping the cultural modality, and I would call them, what would I call them? Well, I would call one of them science. It's the other one that I'm having trouble with. It is everything which is not anchored in the rational. You know, the 20th century is the most spectacularly celebratory, has the most spectacular celebratory affair with the irrational since the 16th century. I mean, never before have so many prophets, wizards, wise women, casters of runes, and seers of visions moved among the people, plying their wares. And part of this is brought on by the tension between the failure of the education system at the very moment of an inflationary expansion of knowledge, so that it's very hard to be au courant in all fields. And if you're not current in a field, then probably your version of that field is some kind of story, a myth. You know, I mean, if you can't keep up with quantum physics, why not fall back on archangels? You know, it requires less intellectual engagement or something like that. Discourse is fragmenting. Fields of discourse are evolving vocabularies so rapidly that the understanding of these vocabularies is not penetrating very far beyond the core group of workers. So then this is creating kind of islanded systems of self-reference, where outside those systems of self-reference, information doesn't travel. The people who are the gene splicers know very little about remote sensing, and both of those parties know very little about recent discoveries in astrophysics, for example. So there's an intellectual fragmentation. I live in Hawaii and in a forest in fairly remote conditions, and so I entertain all this in my mind all the time and try to, my faith, and I assume it's the psychedelic faith, although we've had some fairly existential characters in our ranks over the years. But the psychedelic faith, I think, is that the universe is beautiful in the Platonic sense, and therefore good and true. In other words, we're optimists. We're not flailing existentialists. We're not relativists, because we have a real standard to measure our spiritual coinage against. So we're not relativists. This is a point I'm really keen to make, because we're embedded in relativism. It's all around us. It's the air we breathe. But it is not inimical to the psychedelic community. I mean, I think the psychedelic experience is the only authentic source of reliable contact with the numinous. I mean, meditation and so on is all very fine, but it requires a leisure class involved in philanthropic support of this kind of foolishness, where the psychedelic experience is immediate and real. So now I've lost my way here. Yes. No, optimism. So I sit in Hawaii and I look at all this and I try to contextualize it and come out with a good story, because I think the best story will win. So if you can get together the best version of how it should all come out, so shall it be. And I work at this because in the past I've been very, very happy with the results between my interior fantasy and the unfolding of historical developments. I mean, I wished for LSD, and then it happened, and then I dreamed of the internet, and then it happened. So I should keep at this.
Definitely. We should.
And I recently read a very interesting book called 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History by Michael DeLanda. And if you get a chance, you should take a look at this. And he made a point which caused me to expand his point into this little thing I'm going to tell you now. But his point was that human beings are very involved in the movement of geological material. That as a species, we move rocks around on a very large scale, and of course it's interesting, some of the earliest human structures are the most physically massive and weighty, like the Great Pyramids. So DeLanda made this point about our relationship with the geological stratigraphy of the Earth, and that cities were a kind of geological extension of the process of crystallization, carried on through the intermediation of a biological unit, i.e. intelligent primates who are building these structures. And I thought that was very interesting. I had never considered it before. I've talked about virtual reality, and I've said that it's nothing new, that was a virtual reality, and Çatalhöyük was a virtual reality, but done in stucco and fired ceramic and stone, and that when the medium is so intractable as stone, the epistemic assumptions that get formed about what reality is are very different than if you can build Versailles at the click of a mouse button. But nevertheless, it's the same. But embedded in my reading of DeLanda was, I've been thinking a lot, and I talked to you a lot last year, about artificial intelligences and minds which are not human, minds which are very different from us, intelligence which is very different from us. While the naive are scanning the stars, our appliances have become telepathic. There is a very strange kind of intelligence being called into existence by ourselves, strangely enough. And this is the connection to DeLanda, this artificial intelligence which is being called into being by human activity is made of the same materials as and Çatalhöyük. It's made of ceramics, glasses, and metals. It's that... So then I took this on board and thought about it. And I've sort of come to some kind of cyber-pantheistic Emersonianism, which is... Here, I'll give it to you as a headline and then work backwards so that in case I forget what I'm saying, it won't be lost to suffering mankind. The Earth's strategy for its own salvation is through machines, is what it is. And human beings are some kind of, we are the deputized spouse. We are the bride in this alchemical rarefaction of glasses, ceramics, metals, and volatile materials. Apparently, the Earth is like some kind of an embryonic or fetal thing. And at the end of its gestation, what is happening is it is ramifying its nervous system, is appearing in its developmental, in the unfolding of its morphogenesis. And as we contemplate nanotechnologies and see ourselves working through bacteria and this sort of thing at the engineering level, you have to be blind to not then reflect back upon the fact that in some sense we are already working at that kind of level at the behest of it is not clear who, because nobody ever asked the question in quite this way before. The answer to who, I think, is the Earth. And that what lies ahead at the end of the linear tunnel of Western subjectivist, positivist, structuralist assumptions that we've been operating, when we hit the end of the tunnel and burst out into the larger mental space of cosmic evolution, what we are going to find is that we are partners, actors in a cosmic drama that involves the Earth at one polarity and machines at the other polarity, as the expression of the will of the Earth toward a kind of self-reflective transcendence that is achieved through machine-human biotic symbiosis. And this is, there'll never be a headline which says this. Some people won't even notice that it's happening, because these large-scale processes can be described by many metaphors at many depths. But I'm telling you, I think this is what's going on. The reason I like this story is because it's not a story about processes out of control. It's not a story about human guilt. It's not a story full of we musts and we shoulds. It's a story which gives honor to every part of the unfolding experience field. In other words, biology, technology, human culture, human traditional values, transcendent human dystopian values. It's a story of things on course, on time, and under budget. And I assume that's how nature really operates. And that we live inside some kind of anxiety-producing culture that is a necessary, I don't want to say evil, but a necessary response to conditions of stress. There are processes which let waste, nuclear waste buildup, urbanization, land disturbance. There are processes which, if allowed to run on indefinitely, would wreck the whole system and pitch it into chaos. But Confucius said, no tree grows to heaven. And what he meant by that is it's fruitless to project any process to infinity, because any process projected to infinity creates some kind of catastrophic scenario. If no fruit flies died in 6 months, the Earth would spin out of its orbit from the weight of fruit flies. No, I don't think that's true. But what an image, right? Somebody once told me if the Earth completely disappeared except for its nematodes, that you could still see the outlines of the continents if you were standing on the moon. I thought, now just who gathered this factoid? So then, to bring this back around a little, where is the psychedelic experience in all of this? Well, it used to be called, or at one phase it was called, consciousness expansion. And consciousness expansion in human beings is going to become an absolute necessity, because we are summoning out of the woodwork of cybernetic technology machines that are going to require super intelligent humans to direct and have discourse with them. This is happening. It is already happening. I mean, the internet is this. I mean, it doesn't tap you on the shoulder and remind you to brush your teeth, but it is, a partner in the understanding of the world that is genie-like. That's the image I have when I sit down to it. It is all John Dee would have asked of his archangelic messengers. He wanted instantaneous information on the political situation in the courts of Europe. He wanted information on the course of the Drake's expedition, then on the other side of the planet. The internet is this kind of magical, intelligent prosthesis. And as I said, there won't come a dramatic moment, I think, a la Lawnmower Man or something like that. These things are much more seeping. The only people who in fact can see the game move against the background of the forest pattern are psychedelic heads. You have to think about this stuff, and you have to develop vocabularies for catching it in action. This is what the game of being an intellectual is, I think. Trying to see the process of morphological unfoldment in action and guess the direction in which it's headed. Because it's inevitably headed toward greater density of information at greater speeds, higher level integrative metaphors, visually rather than textually displayed, transformation of such graphic and glyphic elements over time, it becomes more and more like the interface of a computer, more and more like some kind of machine environment. I mean, we have thought for, I assume, at least 100,000 years, maybe much longer. But the quality of thought, it was early. When it was early, it was intermittent. It was thin. It was a groping. It was an undigested intuition, a perception slipping away from the mind's eye because of media reinforcement and education and acculturation and the passage of 100,000 years. The voice of the mind, the logos, has grown stronger, but now it takes an exponential leap forward into visualization, into manifestation through this information processing prosthesis that integrates us all. And, I can imagine a future not very far away where the individual, the expression of the individual is lowered, is more muted. I mean, this is the most individualistic, individual worshipping century, the century just ending, that we have ever known. And its great accomplishments, its great works of art were all accomplished by individuals, and political undertakings such as the Third Reich and so forth and so on, also highly motivated individuals who rose above the masses. I'm not sure we can afford the luxury of that kind of exhibitionistic individualism in the future. And I think probably it's not that we're talking about a restriction of human rights. We're talking about a transformation of human drives. the states of integration and collectivity that will be sold as public utilities in the next century are anticipated now by group psychedelic experiences, ayahuasca sessions, this sort of thing. And the dichotomy, and I think I made this clear when I talked about the earth and machines, the dichotomy between the natural and the artificial is an obsession of the 20th century, hence canceled now. In fact, a whole bunch of things are canceled. We were talking at home about how Roger Shattuck, in his History of Dada, said that the 20th century couldn't wait to be born. It was born in 1888 at the death of Victor Hugo. And then I said, well, so if it was born in 1888, when did the 20th century end? And I think it ended in 1992. It expired early with the birth of the World Wide Web. What defined all that, modernity, was mass media. You know, mass media shaped that whole psychology, and it is now archaic. It is now, it's not archaic, it's obsolete. It's wonderful that the phrase 20th century is beginning to have that wonderful brown gravy Edwardian tone that used to be reserved for the term 19th century, meaning, you know, those terribly stuffy and confused and rather silly people who just didn't quite get it right, but were doing the best they could and muddling through, and thank God they gave way to us, the people of the 21st century. Let me see here. Is there a flashlight? I have a page full of notes. I needn't be so... Is there anything here that wasn't touched on? Well, some notes about this planetary intelligence. Thank you, Julie. And how all that works. One of the insights that I've been reading different people this year, maybe you can tell, and one of the people I've been reading is Greg Egan, who I talked about last year, but now I've read more. Now I've read Diaspora, and the ones where he makes no effort whatsoever to explain it to you unless you've already done your homework. And and then Jonathan today, in his lecture, talked about DNA a little bit, and frame slippage and all of that. And it reminded me of it. The thing that I'm coming to from my psychedelic experience and my life experience and the whole ball of wax is, I've said for many, many years that the world is made of language. That was just sort of one of my bumper stickers. But I think that there's that carries some of the flavor of what I want to say there. But that there's more to it than that. It's that everything is code. Everything is code in the sense that hackers mean when they say they write code. When Sasha stands up and waves his arms and draws what he calls the dirty pictures, he initiates you into a code, a vocabulary with very defined rules and quick to learn, and then they're like tinker toys. Once you know the rules of the connectivity, then you can sit down like a child and begin to stick these things together and say, well, what would this be like, and what would this be like, and does God allow this, or does this break the rules, and so forth. The DNA is like that. Human language is like that. Human body language is like that. Machines communicate like this. In fact, this is a bridge which connects us. This is the great overarching bridge which will connect us to the machines, that they, like us, are commanded by language. And so this realization that everything is code, and code moving on many levels, is, I think, a further it's more primary than the perception, for example, that things are made of space, time, matter, and energy. That's one level below code. The code codes for space, time, matter, and energy. It's much more like we're in a simulacrum, some kind of machine environment. And in fact, I like that idea because I've always sensed, and psychedelics have always intensified this intuition in me, that the universe is a puzzle. Life is a problem to be solved. It's a conundrum. It's not what it appears to be. There are doors. There are locks and keys. There are levels. And if you get it right, somehow it will give way to something extremely unexpected. DMT is a perfect example of that. And of course, at the molecular level, it literalizes that metaphor. I mean, the DMT is the molecular key, the extraneous object introduced into the front door of the synaptic receptor. And then, you can plunder the palace for 5 minutes. Well, if the world is code, then it can be hacked. In other words, it needn't stand still in quite the same way that it stands still in your mind if you believe in something called the laws of physics. It permits magic because it says behind the laws of physics is a deeper level, and if you can reach that deeper level, you can make changes there. And this leads on to something that I wanted to say about an earlier theme, where I was talking about the legitimation of the community's intuitions. Something that we always kick around at these things, or I always bring it up in some form, is where do the hallucinations come from? We arrived late last night after a 24-hour trip from Hawaii that was just hell, or as much hell as modern airlines can legally inflict upon it. and got stoned, and then we were laying there, and it always happens when you're cut off from cannabis for long periods like that. When you return to it, it's 10 times as strong. Yeah. And the hallucinations were exquisite. And I've been looking at hallucinations now for 30-some years. And I looked at these last night, and I thought, if someone would ask me what were they like, what would I have to say? And I said, indescribable. Indescribable. And I looked and looked, and I could look to my heart's content, and they were indescribable. So we always come around to this question, where do the hallucinations come from? And I suppose the unconscious reductionists among us, and I don't mean that they're unconscious, I mean that they unconsciously use reductionism, probably assume that it's some kind of iteration thing, that bits and pieces of everything you've ever seen are rolling in some kind of neurological kaleidoscope that can run forever and just produce this endless download of drifting imagery. But there's a problem with that, because this stuff is too coherent, it means too much, it's too emotionally charged. Well, we have never really rallied as a group to try and locate in our combined opinions the one or several sources of these images. And I think that and I talked a bit about this last year, but I think this is legitimate perception of thoughts, places, things, times, and objects that either have existed somewhere in the universe, or do exist, or have existed in the minds of beings somewhere, sometime in the universe. In other words, that we have to begin to take seriously the consequences of generalizations like quantum connectivity. In other words, it's one thing to bask in the light of the overarching metaphor, which says everything is connected to everything else. It's quite another thing to say, and so then what are the consequences for me of this? And the answer seems to me to be that, that the imagination, the inside of our heads, really is the most vast frontier imaginable. And we must leave it for future generations, or maybe not generations, but future evolutionary biologists to figure out why an animal nervous system would evolve a propensity for accessing Bell non-local data. In other words, quantum mechanically accessible data at a different level of the physics of things. There must be a reason. And in the same way that the problem of speciation posed a problem for 19th century biology, this can pose a problem to our thinking without it sinking our intellectual enterprise. It is for some more sophisticated future group of thinkers to understand why this is so. What we have to grapple with is that it is so. That it is so. That you have the Hubble telescope inside of you. You have inside of you an informational gathering instrument that can give you good intelligence about things so immeasurably distant from this point that to state it in numbers and units is meaningless. It's just elsewhere, the elsewhere of the absolute infinity of the plenum of imagination in which apparently beings rise and fall like plankton in the sea. And of course the psychedelics are the naturally evolved nanomachinery of the Gaian matrix that knits together this cosmic ecology, this system of living relationships. I'm not impatient with the idea of extraterrestrial life or intelligence, just its pop regurgitation. But I think probably planets like the Earth are alive and conscious, and they use the technologies that the species native to them evolve to cast images out into the larger universe, that the dialogue among cosmic minds is a dialogue among entire planetary ecosystems. It can't be trivialized into some take me to your leader scenario. Still less can it validate the unscheduled visit of pro bono proctologists from nearby star systems. Oh, I know, one other thought that in assessing this year in science, I talked about omega, the cosmological constant, and that is really incredible. In fact, let me do a personal breast beating thing and point out to you that this thing that they have come upon, omega, the cosmological constant, this absolutely, 50 years ago or so, Einstein called it the biggest blunder I ever made, because he played with the necessity of this thing to keep the universe from falling in on itself, and then he decided it was an unnecessary construct and that it led to such weird conclusions that it had to be gotten rid of. And so that was all very well and good until these recent measurements of the distances of certain supernovae carried out independently by several teams of astrophysicists brought the news that the universe is expanding faster than the laws of physics allow. And when they looked at how much faster, they realized that it called the cosmological constant back into existence. Well, but here there are a couple of things about this cosmological constant that are very counterintuitive. The first is that it it acts on empty space. It does not require matter to manifest. It is a property of space itself, the cosmological constant. The second thing is, it's a repulsive force that is growing stronger and stronger. Forces don't grow stronger and stronger. They grow weaker and weaker. Gravity grows weaker, light grows weaker, everything grows weaker. This force, as time progresses, gets stronger and stronger. Well, that means when you project it out toward, billions of years into the future, it becomes the dominant force. It overcomes gravity, it overcomes the strong force, the weak force, it overcomes all the forces, it becomes the dominant force. The other thing about it is that it becomes stronger not on an even slope, but asymptotically. It becomes stronger. Well, now this produces something very much like what I've been yakking about since 1971, the novelty wave, the so-called time wave. It too grows stronger and stronger through time, and it too has this kind of built-in asymptotic acceleration where it experiences a kind of inflationary expansion in power. The two map over each other very well. But when you talk, returning now to the cosmological constant, when the astrophysical community realized the consequences of taking this on board, they realized that it was dissolving the entire model of what cosmology has been throughout the 20th century. Because what it's really saying, this discovery, less than 6 months old, is that space itself is in the act of exploding, that the universe is on the cusp of an inflationary phase of expansion similar to the inflationary expansion that occurred at the time of the Big Bang. What would this look like? What would it feel like? Nobody can even imagine. It is not upon us. I don't mean that. But I mean that in the near future of the universe, in the next billion or 2 billion years, things will change very, very dramatically. Everything will begin to rearrange itself according to the expression of this asymptotic power. So that was the biggest news in astrophysics. The other news, which has psychedelic implications, I think, also comes from astrophysics. As you may recall, last August, I think it was, I can't remember exactly, every man, woman, and child on Earth got the equivalent of a dental X-ray when there was a thing called a star quake on a magnetar, a magnetic neutron star 20,000 light years away, experienced a catastrophic collapse, and there was a wave of gamma rays that were turned on every light in the system when it hit the planet. And an event like that had never been observed before. And I got to thinking about this, and I realized, we've only been looking for this kind of thing for 30 years. There's probably quite a bit of this kind of anomalous, high-energy, short-duration fluctuation of radiation going on in the galaxy. And then I had a kind of an image, I wouldn't say a vision, but a kind of an image of how things are really arranged on the larger level in terms of the galaxy. And the image was of a donut. And we're accustomed to being told that we're out at the edge of the Milky Way, where stars are few and far between. That this is the boonies, in other words. But I'll bet you the boonies are where biology thrives, because the low star density and the distance from the galactic core and these extremely energetic events at the core would create a kind of donut situation where it's the toroidal area out near the rim where stars are slow burning and they don't collide with each other and planets can form, and you get the 5 billion year run you need to get to a civilization. But a rule of biology and strategy and everything and religious practice, as far as that's concerned, is seek the light. Well, the light is at the core. And so then I saw, maybe the true seeking of the light requires biology to go into partnership with something beyond biology, because the environment at the core is so energetic. And I'm not suggesting the actual core, that's beyond contemplation. That's a black hole. No technology imaginable can get even near the event horizon of an object like that. But I mean in the vicinity of the galactic core, where the star density is 200 to 300 times greater than it is in our vicinity. Those kinds of environments are so fraught with peril for biology that probably downloading ourselves into machine symbiotes of some sort is the only way to go to those places. In one of Greg Egan's novels, he pictures a human future where this is one option. You can fuse yourself with a starship and set out to check out the neighborhood. Or you can join the Amish and till rye in Pennsylvania. Actually, I think you can't do that because something's happened to the earth. But some Hamish possibility is still available. Well, this is not like the sort of thing the other faculty members will be talking to you about, which is an intense and primarily important download of the homework, the chemistry, the botany, the behavioral impact, the archaeology, the ethnography of these substances. I ask myself all the time, how are we different from other people? Are we morally superior? Are we smarter? Are we richer? Are we kinder to the people we meet? And actually, the longer I look, the less I can tell. There are extraordinary examples of all of these things in and outside of our community, and extraordinary nudniks and jerks inside and outside our community. But we have in our hands tools that I think, if people were correctly presented with them and understood without hype and hysteria and hyperbole what this psychedelic enterprise is about, that we would win them to our cause, because our cause is the human cause, the cause of thinking and communicating and building and bringing into existence new forms of beauty, new possibilities for being. And this can be done without psychedelics, certainly. But with psychedelics, it is accelerated. And it has a feeling not only of immediacy, but of, the only way I can put it is correctness. It isn't the lonely neurotic artist thrashing toward some kind of self-reflection. It's the firm guiding hand of a greater mind, the logos, the earth, I'm not sure, but a greater mind. I mean, true art truly is truly inspired. And the muse, I don't think, was more real for Homer than it is for each and every one of us when we're in the presence of the mushroom, or ayahuasca, or DMT, or LSD, or something like that. So, I suppose I will go to the grave with life as mysterious to me as I found it when I came to consciousness around 6 or 7. But I think life is, whatever it is, it's an opportunity of some sort. And the things I have been most grateful for were the things that I met at the frontiers of knowledge, of sexual experience, of psychedelic experience, knowing, feeling, and being one with being are how I would categorize that breakdown. So I think the future is bound to be very confusing and demanding for most people. And there are many claims on each of us and our intellectual loyalties and where we put our energy. Should we tolerate relativism? Should we be Mahayana Buddhists? What's our position on the Huichol? How do you relate to Monica? All these things have to be sorted out, you know. But I feel actually like the thing that I always dreamed of in my early youth was a miracle. I didn't particularly like Ouspensky's book In Search of the Miraculous, but I loved the title, and I used to just sort of chant it as a mantra. In search of the miraculous, just one. I knew the rules. Just one is enough, because one secures the possibility of an infinitude of miracles, whether you have observed them or not. Well, now I'm 52, and I've seen, I don't know, 4 or 5, which is 4 more than necessary to make me a lifetime optimist. But the recurrent, the enduring miracle, however it's achieved, is the psychedelic rush. You know, that giddying moment when all bets are off, all boundaries dissolve, the machinery of language fails, the adjectival wheel wells burst into flame, and then, you know, you achieve orbital velocity and are in the presence of the thing. And I cannot believe that is not a salutary experience. And you've heard me say many times how itchy it makes me feel to think that somebody could go from birth to the grave without having that experience. They can make of it what they want. They can denounce it. They can deify it. But one should have it, because it's one of the compasses, the primary compasses of being. And it's larger than the historical context. I mean, the point of this talk tonight was to talk about linearity and idea systems and the nonlinear impact of these drugs and the way they break down media bias. But all these intellectual ideas exist in the light of the sun of this unspeakable primary experience, and we can draw it, paint it, sculpt it, act it, dance it, drum it, and never take anything away from it, never define it, never occlude it. It is a miracle. It's like having the presence of a deity. It's, I think, very hard for me to open myself up at any given moment to the full implications of how fortunate I am and how good life is in the shadow of this particular tree. Anyway, that's the formal talk for tonight. Thank you very much. And now we'll entertain questions, which is usually much more fun. So Anybody got a take on that, or want to say something completely oblique, or anything else?
Last year. We start with last year. Human intelligence, our giant intelligence, artificial intelligence, extraterrestrial.
Can you speak up?
You'll repeat it.
Well, the question is about the discussion about artificial intelligence. You mean the hierarchy of the
Yes,
relationship
please.
of
Yes.
these things? Well, I don't know. I guess it's becoming easier for me to be a mystic about the Earth than to think that we are going to be rescued by the Galactic Federation. I think that the Earth, that it's a profound connection. The Earth is the foundation of everything. It's the foundation of biology, and it's the foundation of machine culture and machine architecture. So, if you can imagine that a redwood is alive, it's much easier for me to imagine that there is some kind of slow-moving, telluric intelligence that may have begun as a homeostatic system. In other words, to stabilize the atmosphere, to create a chemical environment that had a momentum to it that wasn't driven by the cosmic ambiance. You understand what I mean?
Something with feedback, perhaps.
Yeah, feedback mechanism. And then, of course, people say, well, it's very hard to imagine it because there are no genes, there is no nervous system, there is nothing that we can quite... But I think that, first of all, we don't know a great deal about the Earth, the ocean currents, its magnetic fields, its 32 nutational and precessional motions, its core dynamics, its distribution of materials. It is complicated, and that's what's always required for self-referential and feedback systems to evolve. Life evolved on the surface of the Earth. Now, in the usual story of this, the Earth is not a major player, it's just sort of where it happened. But on the other hand, what if you took the view that the Earth permitted or coaxed into existence or made possible or encouraged or enzymatically catalyzed these processes? And the geomagnetic reversals, the glaciations, the ebb and flow of nitrogen levels in the atmosphere, all of this has pumped biology. And it's always been presented as, well, the cosmic environment is unpredictable, and so you get fluctuations introduced from the outside by random factors, asteroidal impacts, so forth and so on. But again, this is just a first try with the data. This is just somebody blowing smoke, basically. The fact is, you're presented with an extremely organized and coherent situation, the Earth with its many species and ecosystems, and you don't know how it got there. And you don't know where it's headed either. Now, our culture is a culture of guilt, and so the story of civilization is supposedly a story of rape, mayhem, turning the wrong direction, losing the connection. To some degree that may be true, but I think it gives much too much credit to humanity in that it actually hypothesizes that human beings, a primate species, could overwhelm nature's dynamic drive toward order and beauty and take control of things. Well, that's our myth about ourselves, is that we can take control. But we never have gotten control. All of our societies have been a mess. All of our explorations have been brutal and negatory. So, and now comes the machines. And they are produced by biology, which comes from the Earth. And what are these machines made of? Well, glass, crystal, arsenic, copper, gold, all these things, and they're being hooked together exactly on the model. Clearly the machines are modeled on biology. We talk about connecting them. We talk about languages. We use a vocabulary that we had for biology to talk about these things. And you see, there's a funny thing built in there, which is we are designing the machines to be more and more intelligent. But what we don't understand is that they operate in a different universe from us, because we operate at about 100 hertz. A machine you can buy down at any computer store operates at 400 megahertz. That means that you can run an eternity of human lives in an afternoon. It means, in a way, that we are creating a creature that lives in a different kind of temporal universe than us. And we are teaching them to design themselves to be ever more intelligent. And once some kind of intelligence arises, because it's intelligent, the first thing it does is design a more intelligent version of itself. Well, at 400 megahertz, and with a worldwide amount of processing power to draw on, you can imagine something coming to embryogenesis in a matter of hours. Something emerging, recognizing itself for what it was, and then just starting up the ladder. And what would this look like to us, and where is our place in it? This is the adventure of the future. We are going to be a different kind of people, because we're going to have to live in the presence of alien minds that will be manifestly and obviously alien. They won't hold back, and they're not going to be, at every moment interested in us either. In fact, we will become, a footnote in their encyclopedia of being, and what they become in our encyclopedia of being remains to be told. But this is all happening, and it's just a matter of the coalescence of technology and language before more and more people recognize it. As I say, there isn't a speed bump. There isn't a dramatic moment where everybody gets it. But when you talk to the people who actually work in these fields, they know, that this is the Faustian enterprise of all time. That this is the handing over of the destiny of the planet to the companion mind that our history and our science and our souls caused us to summon into being. It's pretty interesting, I think. Yeah, something else. Anything else. There have been times in the past where the time wave has been very congruent with something that I thought was really vulgar and trivial and stupid. It's very good with American presidential elections, strangely, and I've always had trouble pitching that to people, especially in foreign countries where people are just on that and say, you think we care or anybody cares? On the other hand, events come bundled together. It certainly will be a relief to get Monica behind us. If there should be some hysteria or cave-in the ranks at the last minute and the president is removed, then that would be extraordinarily novel in terms of the functioning of modern democratic institutions, that a twice-elected president could be removed in that fashion. I don't know. I was amused by the fact that it was congruent, and I suppose I should grab all the credit I can. Of course, we're not there yet. There could also, something could go haywire, and this trial could go on for 6 months. So we shouldn't beat our breasts too early in the game. Anything else?
It seems like the concept of novelty implies the presence of an observer, someone who can say, that's novel or that's not. And that sort of introduces the specter of relativism. If something unusual happened in the middle of a forest and there was no one there to be surprised by it, would it be novel?
Well, that's a good question. for example, like for instance, the rise and fall of the Mayan civilization, as it contributed very little to modern dominant paradigms created in Europe, was it novel or was it not? And I've thought about this different ways. I think that novelty has to survive in order to be novel. But novelty is a hellishly slippery concept. It's related to complexity, which is another slippery concept. And also, as you point out, seems to imply an observer. The observer could be a machine. In other words, you could have a situation where a machine was monitoring, let's say, radioactive decay, and when there were unusual bursts of radiation, in other words, characterized by clustering in time that was statistically anomalous, the thing would record that as novelty. But you know, there has to be some kind of an observer to do most kinds of for any system to function. I think.
So is anomalous the key word there? Every birth yields an infant who has never existed before, totally new, totally novel. But birthing is not novel.
Well, locally it is. If you have a small village and then a woman has a baby, everybody's aware all night long, and the midwife goes and the shaman goes, and then there's a celebration and drinking. It's novel locally. And most novelty is like that. Most novelty has a very limited sphere of influence. That's why you can have two people here tonight, and one is listening raptly to what I have to say because they always wanted to be in Mexico and have this wonderful experience, and now they are. And the person next to them just fought with their partner and had a little too much to drink and lost their wallet and is feeling terrible. Well, they're both experiencing forms of novelty. Neither is contaminating the other, we hope, even though they may be sitting side by side. So our novelty is a personal thing. On the other hand, there is a global novelty, which is almost, you could picture it as the averaging, the sum of all these individual states of mind. So it is possible, for instance, in a rising stock market to lose money. It is possible to be at the party of the century and leave early because you thought everyone was boring.
Hey, if it's new to you, it's new.
This has actually happened to several people. You know, there was a party, 10 years ago in New York, given by Andy Warhol for Tennessee Williams, and everybody on earth was there. And I mentioned it to somebody once, and this guy said, yes, well, I got there early, and the canapes were no good, so I left. It's sort of like, is it Lord Buckley who does the routine about the people who were in Jerusalem at Passover at the time of the crucifixion, but didn't notice or were too cynical to have anything to do with it, where the guy is sitting in the bar and says, does he still come in here? And the bartender says, yeah. And he said, and is he still running with that floozy? He says, you mean the Magdalene? And the guy says, I know, whatever. So that's how novelty works, right over the hill from the Sermon on the Mount. People were playing checkers. But nevertheless, there is, I think it would be hard to argue, would it not, that novelty is now globally on the increase, and that whether you are or are not getting along with your partner, novelty is invading your life and shaping it more and more. Certainly if you have anything to do with high technology, or if you have anything to do with cutting-edge science, design, media, whatever, then you're constantly struggling with novelty, the novelty of new techniques, new tricks from the competition, new machines, new tools, new concepts of how to do things. And as I say, if you monitor the sciences, the rate of revolution is becoming people are numb from what is going on.
Future shock.
They just can't bring it into focus. And this cosmological constant thing is a perfect example. But, you know, Europa as a haven for life, magnetic earthquakes on neutron stars rippling the space-time field, all these things advancing at an incredible rate. Anything else? Or
Yeah, I was just comment. I was thinking, at the risk of all those physicists that are going to be put out of work, right? You know, you're talking about omega theory, and I'm thinking, oh, remember the last time this happened? The world isn't flat, and, you know, hundreds and hundreds of people who think 600 years ahead of their time get put to death by the prevailing reality because it can't handle that it's going to lose its jobs. It's basically, what do you see for this? How can this prevailing reality lose its jobs without taking, you know, people like us out with it? Basically what I'm asking you, because you know it's going to have to come down. You know it has to be dismantled. Do you have any advice for this?
you mean how the socioeconomic thing is going to, what it's going to do with itself?
Yes.
Well, I think that was it Edgar Casey or someone, or no, it was the Fortean guy who said, when it's steam engine time, there comes steam engines. And I think you can't force these paradigm shifts. That the people in the control situations have to begin to understand what is happening and respond. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. My faith has always been that nobody is in control. And that one of the interesting things about capitalism that is not basic to capitalist theory about itself is that systems in capitalism are highly decoupled. So, for instance, a company can go bankrupt and it doesn't affect the company 2 floors up at all. It is largely decoupled. So that means all crises in capitalism are locally dealt with and locally solved. So it's much more like a Darwinian environment where competition and refinement of strategy is rewarded with survival. So I think it's very flexible. The biggest addiction of capitalism is to things. If you could create a capitalism of data, you could run it till the end of eternity. And this may be coming. One of the ideas that's strong in Greg Egan's fiction is that, we've only been thinking about virtual reality for a dozen years or so, and it's very crude and cartoon-like. But now that we know that this is a possibility to build immersive technologies that create simulacrums of local reality, you have to realize, well then, any intelligent life form on its way towards sequencing its genome, leaving its home star system, understanding nuclear chemistry, in other words, the basic shit. Anybody who calls themselves a civilization understands these things, would also come to understand the possibility for virtual reality. And so there may be many worlds folded within worlds, even locally, that we can't recognize because we're so caught up on this Flash Gordon metaphor of ships going through Newtonian space from star to star. In one of Greg Egan's novels, there's a thing like a flatworm in this planet, this ocean planet, and they can't even tell, at first they're not even sure that this thing is quote-unquote biology. It's so low as an organism. But then as they get into it, they realize it's not an organism at all. It's some kind of storage device. And it has an entire civilization inside it that doesn't look like flatworms, but that is running on the hardware, running as software on the hardware of this thing. that reminds me of something that I was going to inculcate into the talk tonight. I talked about how everything is code, and a thought which comes packaged along with that is that it is a very powerful metaphor, previously unavailable to us, the relationship between software and hardware. It is all around us. If, and returning to my little Gaian evolutionary scenario, another way to think of it is like this. The Earth is hardware upon which runs the software of biology. Biology is hardware upon which runs the software of culture. Culture is hardware upon which runs the software of the individual personality. So you see, it's a hierarchical structure where each level becomes hardware for the next level. And then you can extrapolate to the step which we must be about to take then. Individual people are the hardware upon which the software of what will be run. That's what we are the processing units for an emergent property, but that's the ladder up which the climb was made.
Terence, I have a question.
Yeah.
In the very beginning, you talked about two things that were impacting on our community, and the first one you said was science, but I wasn't clear about what the second one was.
Oh, well, now that I'm more comfortable. The second is New Age nuttiness and relativism. And let me hit this relativism thing, since my son, I have to report back to him. He couldn't be here this year. He's guarding the house in Hawaii. But he would not let me back in if I couldn't testify that I had dissed relativism royally. What is relativism, first of all? Yeah. Relativism is the idea that it's okay. Whatever you think is okay. If you're a Freudian, a Marxist, a positivist, if you talk to archangels, if you believe in the face on Mars, if you're concerned about Atlantis, it's all okay. In other words, it's a inclusive, friendly, factless worldview where whatever is asserted is honored, and whatever is projected is assumed to be true enough. It makes for a very boring conversation because there's very little juice in that. I think relativism is a symptom of intellectual exhaustion, and it's also maybe on some level socially necessary in a pluralistic society. You know, every day you rub up against Scientologists, Hasidic Jews, Seventh-day Adventists, atheists, this, that, and the other. And so the way we all get along is just by saying, well, you know, you think what you think, I think what I think. Okay, politically that's okay. But in a philosophy class, let's say, this is not okay. The whole point of philosophy is to decide what is shit and what is shinola. And so then, and at first people bridle at the very notion that such a sorting would be proposed. Now we as a community are in a fascinating position vis-a-vis this, because we are not welcome over at the Temple of Science. When they see us coming, they slam the door. If we had asked to have this conference at the National Science Foundation in Washington, I'm sure they would not have been pleased. We're not welcome at the academic Temple of Science. Now, we are welcome over at the New Age Roadshow. But do we wish to be welcome?
There are some parties you should not go to.
Yes, there are parties you shouldn't go to. So, and what does it mean? My take on the New Age for years, and then it just grew so industrially massive that it was even pointless to make this criticism, was that it was a flight from the psychedelic experience. That the psychedelic experience is so difficult to franchise, so difficult to get down to 8 tapes and a series of exercises in a booklet, that they were extremely hostile to it. The paradox of all that was 90% of these New Age entrepreneurs, gurus, product developers, producers, so forth, so on, are psychedelic people. And I hope I'm not bringing a blush to anyone's cheek here tonight. Be assured, I'm not talking to anyone directly. I'm not sure who's here. But we need not consider ourselves part of all that, I think, because what we have is very real. So real that, it terrifies us at times, I'm sure. It is real. It works for skeptics. You're a skeptic, you don't believe DMT is something to think about? Pull up a chair, my friend. Give it give it the same role you would give a neck massage proffered to you in the hallway of the Whole Life Expo. Have you got 5 minutes to spend on the question, are drugs capable of producing life-changing visions? Surely, if you're going to hold an opinion on this subject from here to the yawning grave, you ought to be willing to invest 15 minutes in investigating. Well, 15 minutes is all it takes. On the other hand, if someone wants to get involved with yoga or archangels, yoga is respectable because it goes back 3,000 years, if that is a thing which confers respectability. A lot of things go back 3,000 years. But the things which go back 30 years, and which are dreamed up and endlessly marketed around, I think are symptomatic of just the breakdown of traditional religious values. And people who don't have recourse to psychedelics think they need to believe something. And it's almost like they sit down with the latest issue of Common Ground and decide to choose 3 and explore. And I think it's an unlikely way to you might get somewhere, but it's a better way, I think, would be to push the edges, but with rational criteria. That worked for me. In other words, my approach to the woo-woo has always been to say, I'll look at anything, I'll listen to anything, I'll try anything, but if it doesn't work, I won't say it does. And it is some kind of a mind game. Or it's some kind of it's a flim-flam, it's a glamour thing. It's not about truth, it's about relationships. And, well, as I once said of the occult, it was a way for a lot of ugly people to get laid. And I'm not saying that about the New Age, because they're so beautiful.
Watch it, buddy.
But, and of course, somebody can take on, somebody can be a very religious Hasidic person and psychedelic. Or somebody can be involved in all of these New Age vocabularies and structures and be psychedelic. But I think if you actually push it philosophically, in the case of the New Ager, there's a certain contradiction. Maybe I don't see the contradiction in the Hasid because I'm under the spell of tradition. Mm-hmm. Maybe what psychedelics really push for is a kind of knife-like agnosticism, that's sort of, my approach has been, I never felt the need to believe anything. And if you believe something, 6 months later you'll find yourself stumbling over it because now you need not to believe it. Everything, I think, should be dealt with as if, or provisionally. No two sets of circumstances are alike. It's clear to me that the New Age is probably going to be the dominant spiritual paradigm provider of the next couple of decades. You know, in Greg Egan's fiction, again, he talks about what he calls ignorance cults, and he extrapolates forward into the future where you actually get situations where you have conferences of physicists who are closing in on the ultimate cosmological principle, and these conferences are besieged by mobs of people who do not want the mystery revealed. In other words, where you actually get so slammed to the wall that you will admit, we are for ignorance. You know, we do not want the last veil lifted. We do not want the last chapter read, and we'll stop it because it's blasphemy. This is coming. Well, at that point, if it came to that, I think psychedelic people, I hope, would line up on the side of knowing. Because if consciousness expansion leads to the conclusion that the last veil is should not be lifted, then I'm out of here. I want to lift the last veil. I want to see naked beauty. I cannot imagine that the consequences would not be worth the journey. But that is the statement of an optimist. Anything else?
Hey, Terence,
yeah.
I'm just kind of curious what you use for sources of information on current events, what your media sources are, or whatever.
Well, I think I've defaulted my homepage to Yahoo Top Story. So so several times a day that comes up, and it changes hour to hour. And as far as Monica is concerned, salonmagazine.com has been wonderful, and from the very beginning they understood exactly what this was, and all the screaming and crying about Salon is simply because they were just savage, you know. They understood how this worked, and if you've never gone to that page, why, take a look at it. And they've been very instrumental in, you know, outing David Hales, the payments he received from the Special Prosecutor's Office, and all this witness buying and all this crap that went on down in Arkansas when they were laying this plot in the first place. I surf the web a lot. I mean, I use it if I just think of things and then I go and look. You know, you could almost say I cast it, and then I follow trains of thought, and then I subscribe to a lot of magazines. I don't think it's important, particularly, like, I think I talked about this once before, that in the new world corporate state that's being created, one of the agendas of the world corporate state is the trivialization of national governments. National governments are being shown the door the way the church was shown the door in the 16th century. National governments are being told, you know, build schools, pave roads, we, the corporations, will take over and run the rest of the operation. In that kind of a situation, the point of something like Monica Gate or whatever it is simply, it's a circus. It is a circus. Everyone in it is a clown, and the whole point is, you know, they test marketed this with the O.J. Simpson trial. They test marketed it with the Bobbits and Baby M. I mean, this is simply to make the point that the government is irrelevant, that it may stand or fall. It may be, but that what really lies behind, and this has been pretty, it's interesting how the people have diverged from the media. This is the first time in American history where the media has charged over the horizon like this, and the people didn't follow. And, it's straining the establishment to its limits, because the ordinary the ordinary machinery of manipulation and mind screw is not working.
Increase the dosage.
And it's tearing. It has implications that are beyond the trivial crapola of the surface. It's a cultural war. It's the ultimate battle of Armageddon in the cultural war. And Max Planck said physics progresses funeral by funeral. Well, so apparently does the dialogue of American polity. But ultimately it's horribly boring and requires too much time. And whether it's novel or not, I don't know. There may be other things afoot that push the wave down at this time. There are always other things afoot. Anything else?
Could omega force be the cosmological equivalent of bungee cord jumping?
Well, bungee cord jumping, you jump and you're pulled back. Imagine a bungee cord that kept stretching faster and faster and faster.
The opposite way is the physical engineering of the material of the bungee cord.
Yeah, well, space itself is sort of like in the act of exploding. Although, one of the things you get out of this cosmological constant that's very woo-woo is some kind of Star Trek-y type force, where basically what it's saying is you ought to be able to draw an infinite amount of energy right out of empty space, right out of vacuum.
Beg the question, there may be other things besides space and time to be using for models now.
Well, yeah. If that were true, if you could demonstrate that kind of a technology, you could probably build ships the size of Manhattan. Although we know that, 100% energy conversion occurs when matter and antimatter encounter. That can be done now. If you put an antimatter factory on a spaceship, you would have a rudimentary star drive. But what the real implications of this cosmological constant seem to be is that the old model of the universe was that the universe would either expand slowly forever because it had not enough mass to eventually counteract the outward movement, and so it would go on forever, or it did have enough mass to implode, and after a long while it would slowly reintegrate, and way down in time it would all be together again. But what was always kept intact in this model was that galactic structures, which we see forming within 500 million years of the Big Bang, would be retained throughout the whole disystolic process. Now it appears that if this cosmological constant is real, then the structure of the galaxies and all that is in the process of fading away, and everything is going to become much more homogeneous fairly soon, on a scale of billions of years, and then shortly after that, this inflationary expansion thing will occur, and matter and space and time and energy as we know it will be smeared over a vaster volume, and it's very hard to model the physics of the implications of that. But it means the universe ends up a far different thing than we had thought.
Let's get to the ends of the bungee cord.
Well, this says that there is no end. that it just keeps accelerating and at an ever faster and faster rate asymptotically, and that changes the character of everything. Yeah.
Well, any more thoughts about 2012 related to that new piece of info?
2012. Well, at the rate that everything is happening, my bet would be that 2012 will fulfill itself at least, well, that it will fulfill itself. And then the question is, will it fulfill itself in more ways than one? Now we're close enough to it to suppose a fulfillment that doesn't leave the galaxy rent to ribbons, which would be the discovery of some kind of like time travel technology. And with what they're doing with quantum teleportation and that sort of thing, it's upon us.
Yep.
You know, a technology so weird and unimaginable that you thought it was 5,000 years in the future. It could be 5 years in the future. So I don't feel any need to retreat from 2012. I will be relieved when 2000 has come and gone. I find this whole thing very crazy, and I don't like the messianic, apocalyptic. I think that a lot of the forces that shape society, like religious fundamentalism, are in their last heave on this one. This is the last roll of the dice for all of that. And if there is no discernible unfolding of a messianic or apocalyptic scenario, they may find themselves a phenomenon that is confined to the second millennium and modified to cult status in the third millennium. But until we wade through this date and sort it out, there's going to be a lot of energy around it. People are terrified of the future. The energy for Y2K, you know. I mean, many of the people who claim alarm are actually, it's glee disguised as alarm. They always hoped that God would smite the internet and that they would wake up one morning and it would be January 1st, 1900. Well, that's not going to happen. It just is not going to happen. Probably the ultimate consequence of Y2K is a lot of hardware upgrade is going to occur.
A lot of insurance policies.
But the fear of the future and the fear of the machine and the fear of, drug culture and gender redefinition and youth culture and racial multiplicity and cultural diversity. And, I mean, people just need to unclench, because all these things and much else besides are on the menu at an ever accelerating rate. If the thing in 2012 is real, I think it will be understood generally that it's real sometime before we get there.
And do you think it might be one of those things that, as you pointed out earlier, someone can be having this incredibly transformative experience while someone else is basically snoring next door? You think we'll get to 2012 and then will it be noticed, right? Or will be this effect that's so pervasive, it's so subtle that...
Well, this is the job of
this
is the job of cultural commentators, is to see it. I mean, like for instance, the world today doesn't look that different from the world of 1993. But this is a totally different world. The largest integrated technology in the history of the planet now exists, didn't exist then. So you have to be smart. That's what psychedelics are about, is noticing what is going on and creating language appropriate to the truth of what is going on. Because you only deal with what is going on through language. Well, you can have a language which trivializes, or a language which glamorizes, or a language which inflates, deflates, conflates, and it's like tuning the dials of what is the truth of the thing. You know, you need to be aware of this, and then you need to practice doing it, because the story you tell yourself is the true story.
That's right.
Well, maybe we should knock off here. What time is it? We probably should knock off, unless there's some burning question
Will
about...
there be a conference on that date?
Pardon me?
Will there be a